Welcome everybody to our first seminar of the season. We are very honored to have for the first seminar the head of the School of Fisheries in the Marine Institute, Kevin Anderson. He got his bachelor in education and from Memorial University, and he also got a master's degree in marine policy from London School of Economics. He started his career as a high school teacher and principal in coastal Labrador, but then he started in 1991 in DFO. He was the regional director of Fisheries and Oceans Canada in Newfoundland and Labrador, and he has recently served as senior advisor on Indigenous relations for the department and the Canadian Coastal Guard. He has a lot of experience in marine policy, Indigenous issues, and he has also been an instructor in the Marine Institute for several years in some of the programs that we have here. So, as I said, we're very honored to have him as our first presenter. So, welcome, and we can start now.
Well, thank you. And thank you very much for the opportunity to present here today. I'm going to say today rather than morning, because I'm not sure if people are all in St. John's or some other part of the world. So with this online reality, I'm trying to be more neutral in identifying time. So basically, I speaking earlier, I think it would be appropriate for me to mention a little bit about my role as head of School of Fisheries and perhaps elaborate a little more on my background. Because it'll put some context to why I chose this particular topic, science policy interface in fisheries. So correct, I've been the head of School of Fisheries since May of this year, and I won't go into a lot of the details, but you know the school is quite diverse, as is the Marine Institute. Between the centers and the programs, and many of the programs here are beyond fisheries, involving environmental things. Associated with environmental assessment type jobs and food safety. But we do have specific programs in resource management and fisheries science, which really speak to, I guess, in many ways, the emphasis on fisheries. Sorry, folks, that's my phone. The fisheries context in Newfoundland and Labrador is quite relevant here. No place in Canada where well, that's not quite true. Like many other places in Canada, the cultural significance of fisheries is quite significant. More than just the economics. It's culturally important. It's been pursued from a fisheries perspective for thousands of years. We know there were settlements in the Port of Swall area several thousand years ago, very much a maritime culture. So it's very much about who we are. And of course, very much about the tradition here at the Fisheries and Marine Institute. It's not insignificant or a coincidence that prior to this building, when the building was in another location, the old university in St. John's, it was called the Cod College. And it represents about how people perceive fisheries here in Newfoundland and Labrador. So a little bit about my background and the connection to the topic. So as described earlier in my introduction, I came from Fisheries and Oceans Canada, where I did a variety of jobs like fisheries resource management. I was a fishery officer, actually, as my entry point into the department, enforcement. And I was also the director for enforcement in Newfoundland and Labrador, including the international fisheries on the Grand Banks. And fisheries resource management and regional director general. And just a little bit on that. I mean, that is all aspects of the department, which meant that science, resource allocation, resource management, licensing, policy, the whole gamut of what the department is about, not the Coast Guard, was very much my responsibility. And the Indigenous component was a career-long thing. Special interest, always took advantage of opportunities, negotiated treaties in every Canadian region south of 60, and very much a special topic of very interest of mine on the Indigenous side. And there's a scientific connection here as we move through. So I chose the topic, science policy interface in fisheries, because when I studied at the London School of Economics, My program was about the theory that you introduce managers to a little bit of everything so they have enough information to at least be able to listen to when science or other policy or economist or whoever presented things to help you make a decision. That was what the London School of Economics was all about at that time, that particular program. And since then, it's always intrigued me as to whether or not that's really applied in many of our circumstances. So I sent the topic science policy interface in fisheries, and then I got researching, and it struck me that this topic is far more explored than perhaps I first thought. I've discovered there are numerous journal articles, some books, as well as dedicated academic programs in some Canadian universities on this larger study of policy. That really intrigued me and really scared me in terms of this presentation all at the same time, because it really created a much more research than I anticipated. I should say at the outset that I have used some journal articles and at least one book throughout the source, if you will, of some of the content, and a book called Studying Public Policy, Policy Cycles and Things by Michael Howlett was used extensively. Some journal articles from a guy named Healy, and a very special and interesting one from Suzette Somi that I will talk about in some specifics. So there's others, but I just wanted to make that clear in true transparency and to recognize that there are sources being used here. So next slide, please. So I thought before even starting this conversation that we would talk about policy in general, because I think it's important to explore what it is, because quite often, I think in many communities, including science, we often think of policy as that decision. You know, I see Gary Stenson there, so I'll say harp seal quota as the decision. And that's correct, but that's policy analysis. That's a review, a study of a specific decision or a moment in time. What I'm interested in exploring here today is what's behind the scenes in the policy world. That's some of the drivers of how we get to these points. So I should say from the outset that prior to World War II, the study of policy consisted basically of policy analysis. In other words, the study of a decision. Governments did something or someone did something, and that was reviewed, analyzed, academically critiqued, if you will. Like many things in society, the post-war era, you began to get new things emerge, and policy studies began to focus on the process. So why did we do that? The origin. Who are the players in the policy process? And what are some of the instruments? And I'll explore that a little more, that drive the policy process. And in those days, there was a very early student, Thomas Dye, an early student of the process, and he defined policy as a set of interrelated decisions taken by a political actor or group of actors concerning the selection of goals and means of achieving them within the powers of those actors to achieve. Now, I won't be reading you those slides, by the way, all the way through, but it's necessary in this context. Next slide, please. Continuation of what is policy. Another one of the early students is a guy named Jenkins, and he viewed policy more specifically as a process. Now, I think for many people, that's a little bit outside of what they think of. They think of a policy as a specific outcome, as I noted earlier, but the idea that policy falls into a structured process, I think doesn't necessarily come to mind when people think of policy. And unlike science, which is very elaborate in its structures, and very transparent in the way you can look and see how a decision was derived, data, time series, historical, all that sort of stuff. Unless you go looking in very abstract places, you will not see that for policy. But there is, at least in the theory, a structure behind these policy processes. So part of Jenkins' theory was that rarely do governments address a single problem with a single decision, but with a series of decisions. And I ask you to think about that a little bit. Think about what's going on now. in the COVID reality. Think about the litany of announcements, which may be described as a decision you see continuously. And you'll see that the response to COVID is coming at us in pieces throughout a period of time, because governments are responding to a changing situation, or responding to pressure, or responding to fiscal realities. And that's the process. And I'll come into that a little more in a second. The other thing that's, I think, apparent or obvious with the policy process world is most policy outcomes are likely to be indirect rather than direct. A decision is made to do something. And the next slide, I'll just mention this before I give my example. So, for example, in fisheries, most policy outcomes directly of fisheries policy and management are indirect decisions actually made without fisheries in mind. And the classic example is employment insurance or income support in a broader sense. The decision in Canadian society to have supports for people in circumstances of unemployment is a policy, social, economic decision of a society like Canada. That's clear. That was the intent. Very good one, most people would argue. We compare to what happens in other societies. But here is the issue for something like fisheries. It warps the outcomes because it maintains fisheries in places that otherwise would not exist. It created enormous pressures over the last 30, 40, 50 years. Well, EI actually dates back to the late 40s, but more in Newfoundland's context to the late 50s. It creates pressure for more fish to maintain the local fish plant, to maintain the local fishing community. So it's not that the fish policy decision on the surface of it may have been, okay, too much fish may have been allocated or whatever people assume to be the problem or the outcome. But the real driver lies somewhere else. And I used to tell my students that the regulators of fisheries control about 10% of the policy agenda in fisheries. The rest is driven by other things: the wharf, the school, the communities, the economic status of a region. And with that comes a whole litany of policies, vessel size. And you look at it on the surface and they don't make any sense to people. Why restrict vessels? It's all about how much fish you catch. But they're all about spreading out the economic benefit, and in some cases supporting things like income support. So the intent is a direct thing, but the outcome can be quite significantly different. And nothing, in my view, maybe I'm biased, is more affected by that than fisheries policy for a variety of different reasons that we'll explore throughout the presentation. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that the policy is a process, and this is coming out of the early studies and conclusions as well. But let's think about what we mean by that. So first of all, the policy process is influenced, or in some cases outright controlled, by the organization of the international system. We can listen all day to the broadcast, I should say, and listen to people pronounce on how Canada should, or take control of the nose and tail of the Grand Banks, for example, or how New Zealand should have greater control over the Fletcher plateau off New Zealand, and so on and so forth. But the reality is that's not consistent with international law or the organization of the international system. The system is a United Nations agreement on the structure of the oceans, a series of treaties with countries along the way, 200-mile exclusive economic zones, sedentary stock complexes for outside the 200-mile limit, but not for other species, and a commitment internationally within those international agreements to regional fisheries management organizations, and in some cases, flag state jurisdiction over enforcement. So that's the international system that we try to operate in. So the policy process is driven by that reality. Not a coincidence, by the way, that North Atlantic Fisheries Organization, for the organization manages the fisheries off the east coast of Newfoundland, is actually meeting today, virtually. The organization of society itself drives the policy process as well. I don't want to get into a lot of details here. We don't have the time, but this, the nature of this is, think about countries around the world. Canada versus another more a country like, with a single, dictator, if you will. Think of the history of a society, religion, these kinds of structures. I'll mention institutional frameworks, but so the organization of society itself drives the process. A democracy is different from not a democracy. Then you have the organization of the state. So, there is such a thing in Canada as provincial jurisdiction and federal jurisdiction and industry international piece. The United States is a different construct. Fisheries is managed by the state out to 3 miles. The same construct exists in Australia. Even within Canada, conversation for another time, it's different between the provinces. Quebec manages many fisheries out to 3 miles. Newfoundland and Labrador is the only province where the federal government manages all inland fisheries. It's all about terms of union and relationships and what we chose and what the federal government has delegated, what they're willing to pay for, and what each province is willing to adhere to. So fisheries policy process in Canada is driven by the construct of the state, as it is in many other countries around the world. European Union, where the entire union of 17, I think that's correct, countries, or 20 plus now, have agreed to delegate fisheries to Brussels rather than domestic affairs. So pretty significant factor. And if you're interested in Europe, look up the common fisheries policy. The political leaders themselves, elected and unelected, of course, but, look south, our neighbor to the south these days, and, responses to situations. The leadership will drive the policy process. I'm not sure where science and government legislation fits in the United States today, but let's not get bogged down on that topic. Appointed officials. The reality is public servants, especially in Canada, have enormous authority on the outcome of the policy decision-making process. They provide advice to ministers. Ministers can choose to take it or not. But ministers cannot deal with the scope and scale of Canada's fisheries policy requirements. So appointed officials play a significant role, both provincially, federally, and within Indigenous organizations, for sure. And then, of course, there are the interest groups, the stakeholders. And I'm not necessarily speaking specifically at all about Indigenous groups in this context, but the fishing industry is organized, harvesters, processors, and obviously they have significant influence on the policy process. Some would argue too much, but it depends on how you look at the broader context of where things are coming from. Next slide, please. And continue on. So you have research organizations like universities. So Memorial, I understand, doesn't play a role in policy. But I think what Memorial is really saying is doesn't play a role in policy analysis. It doesn't get involved in the actual policies of fisheries. But universities absolutely are involved in the larger policy process, whether fisheries or otherwise, because they are doing research that influences our knowledge and information, the enormous expertise that universities can bring to the table, and the fact that many are independent, free to speak, if you will, and that contributes to the public's understanding and views of fisheries. And that's a part of the issue here, is all this information flow. And that's a theme I think I want to bring forward today. Kim is on the line, of course, media. Media has played a big role for a very long time in influencing our thinking. And now I put social in brackets because here is a brand new world where information is just misinformation in many cases, is just traveling throughout the world at a rapid pace. And I have observed many examples of social media having a very significant impact. But media has played a role. The ban on drift net fishing in the Pacific Ocean and the consequences for bycatch of other species was driven by information passed on to the American consumer that influenced their choices in a grocery store. That was the policy outcome for the closure, not necessarily some conservation imperative that someone concluded in some government institution or regional fisheries management organization. So judiciary is different. It depends on the country. But think about Canada, for example, about how policy process is influenced by the judiciary I'll just name you one, the Marshall Decision. You can go online today and see what's happening in the maritime PE, mostly in Nova Scotia, but maybe in PEI as well. The decisions of courts, and there are many, many in Canada, that drive some of the things that you may see in fisheries, thinking they're a policy decision on the corner of someone's desk. Fleet separation, a court decision in Canada, powers of provinces versus the federal government, the early cases. Prior to 1927, fish processing in Canada was a federal responsibility. It was lost in a court case in British Columbia in 1927. So these are the kinds of things where the legal system has a huge influence. Next slide, please. So, as is the case, I think, with most things, there is a larger agenda setting process going on behind the scenes that drives the way we think in society. And agenda setting process can happen very quickly in response to a crisis like a war, a pandemic, an economic crisis like a depression, or it can be much slower and not so obvious to see and understand, or it could be very dedicated. And in the political context, there could be a specific ideology that drives the agenda setting process. So we often think of ideology here, you can think of it as communism versus capitalism, but you could also think of it as political parties, the Conservative Party of Canada view of fisheries versus the New Democratic Party's view on fisheries, or the current governing Liberals. I think this is far more obvious as we watch, if you can tolerate CNN. If you watch these things in the United States, you see the ideology playing out much more pronounced and influencing the agenda setting process in general. Not so obvious how what it means to fisheries in the United States, but you can really see a good example of how ideology affects society's sense of where we're going. I think the one that's connected back to the media and information is public opinion. And I noted my example about tuna. Clearly, public opinion is a huge driver in decision making. Governments are doing it all the time. All of us do it all the time. We're very cognizant, and by public we could go narrow, to a community, faculty, students, versus a community like St. John's or something, or broader on a national or international level. But the agenda setting process and policy is driven significantly by public opinion. Markets, fishery go in a certain direction. Science may be going in a certain direction on an individual species. I think that's very obvious here in the work we do at the Marine Institute. But the markets can either change, go up or down, and completely affect that. Never underestimate the significance of external interference. And I don't mean that in a covert way. Everything from, from a fisheries perspective, it could be sanctions. It could be the seal, the Gary, I acknowledged being on the line earlier, like the seal fishery and how it's managed and the policy choices that are being made from humane harvesting and all of that sort of thing, and Gary's many trips around the world, is significantly influenced by the animal rights movement and things of that nature, external interference. Obviously, level of economic development. I'm always reminded of an excellent example from one of my classes. One particular year, we had a student from somewhere in the Indian Ocean, got her country forgotten now, and I brought in guest speakers to talk about species at risk legislation, and of course, wolffish was very significant. All the research, all the studies, all the scientific activities, and at the end of the class, she raised her hand and said, "Why do you care about wolffish?" And her context was, in my country, we do not have the economic or the financial capacity to engage in this conversation. This is great that you can afford that. Clearly, you have a lot of money, but it's not relevant to my world. Interesting perspective. And never underestimate the whole construct of the institutional framework of society in general, where we came from. And this one is more long-term. It's how we view the role of courts and how we view the role of legislation. And you can see all of that stuff kind of under attack in a social media world, but clearly institutional framework and our sense that there is a structure to things is a big agenda setting component. Next slide, please. So Perhaps I could focus a little bit more for thinking on the role of science in fisheries policy. So let's think about Western society puts science as something essential for solving all problems. You know that. You just had the last 3 months have reinforced that more than ever, 6 months, whatever it is, more than ever. We need a vaccine, and science is going to solve that for us, whoever they are. And you know, it's interesting that we all play a role. Even here at the Institute, there are studies associated with the race to a solution to COVID. And so clearly that's the role, that's where science is on that pedestal, if you will, especially in the Western world and probably the world in general. And very, very significant in persuading public opinion. It's not a coincidence that Dr. Fauci was believed more than the President of the United States in many of those media briefings that were being held, because it's the way the information is presented. It looks coherent, structured. It's that science way of presenting information that helps the public say, oh yeah, that makes more sense than other versions of reality. But in fisheries, we don't always enjoy the same level of public support at all. And there are many, many reasons for that, not the least of which is the nature of fisheries. It's very complex. You know the line, we know less about the ocean than we know about Mars. I'm not sure that's true, but that's what people say all the time. I'm going to speak a little more about this, so I'm not going to elaborate too much yet on what I mean by not the same level of public support. But the other thing about that I think is significant, and perhaps is more indicative of the way the regulators interact with select groups in society rather than society at large. And that is, they're often interactive with very strong groups they have strong interests, either economic, recreational, or environmental, or whatever. And it's very difficult for these forces to come together. And I've observed that the standard line is, when things are good, science is good. When things are bad, science no good. That's what we hear. And I think that's a reality associated with the nature of our interactions. I just for a second, take a sidebar. I once read a very interesting article out of the Netherlands. So Netherlands is a very open society. And in fact, we're actually engaged in widespread engagement and consultations long before Canada. Dating back to the 1950s, they were actively engaging with the farmers around milk marketing in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands abandoned that process because what they discovered about directed consultations, and consultations is a misused word, is that you're only speaking to a narrow component of society. The consumption of milk and the supply of milk and the price of milk was a far bigger issue, not just the farmers. So they actually abandoned it because they thought it wasn't democratic. Interesting, isn't it? Next slide, please. So some of the limitations, that's why I wanted to save my comments for this. So I think the wild capture fisheries largely remain, and I doesn't want to sound too overemphasize this point, but it's the hunter-gatherer stage of human development. We've learned that in school, the hunter-gatherer stage, the agricultural stage, the Mesopotamian Valley, and then, of course, the industrial stage, and arguably the knowledge stage or some version thereof is the fourth stage. But we're chasing wild animals. Whether it rains in February or not, or whether there's salinity or melting ice or ice cover or no ice cover, are the drivers on the abundance. And the ability to manage that is very, very, very complex. Science is trying to estimate, trying to put a number on total allowable catches and understanding species dynamics in a world that's not like silviculture for forestry. It's not like agriculture. It's not the same input controls, if you will. There are significant uncertainties in fisheries science. Fisheries science is very expensive, very costly. It depends on very large ships that cost, I can tell you, $20,000 a day in some cases. And it's not always the amount of funding that you need in a constantly changing world environment, perhaps more so now than any point, is very, very complex and very difficult, and therefore there are uncertainties. There are strong opposing views and perception. I'm speaking to science now and bias within the scientific community. I'm not highlighting that in fisheries any more than anything else. It's true in pharmaceutical, it's true in a whole raft of industries. But the bottom line is different perspectives exist. That in itself is healthy. The problem is when you interface with policymakers, because they can pick and choose, or they can say there's no consistency, or there's no complete understanding. So it's healthy in science, but not necessarily healthy for a narrow group of decision makers that are picking information. And, conservation is a key for a regulator. Yeah, true. And I read things like you may have read some articles that came out of some in after the cod moratorium, where there was a lot of criticism of decisions or lack of people paying attention to science and so on. All true. However, other concerns are there: economic well-being, the fishing industry, regions, and ultimately, in some cases, fiduciary responsibilities of Indigenous communities. I don't think this is a serious problem in Canada, by the way, in terms of contradicting conservation. But don't underestimate that is not a one-dimensional decision-making process. It's not only about the true status of the resource, especially when there's different views, and especially when predictions don't come true or the environment changes too fast. Next slide, please. So continuing on with limitations. So it's constrained by political, fiscal, and other considerations, obviously, in terms of policymaking's capacity to support science. And the immediate response to problems are often driven by externalities. And that's the other thing. Like, you go on a track with a certain way of doing things, and then you get a pandemic, or you get some major change in economic circumstances, or a market is shut down in China for a variety of different reasons. And that is not directly linked to science, but it shifts the priorities. And for an individual scientist working on an individual project, you may see all of a sudden a change in terms of where people see what you do as being important or not. And science advice seemed to be is seen as one of a number of inputs. And I'm saying this from a policy making perspective. It's like, even, you think about an integrated fisheries management plan is one of the pieces. It's not the piece of the process. That depends, by the way, on what jurisdiction you're in. If you were to take a close look at the Norwegian model, you would see something a little different. That legislation in Norway is very, very specific. If something is contrary to science, the whole discussion ends. It depends on where you are. Next, again, Norwegian society arguably are in better position to make that choice due to their economic circumstances. I'm trying to take you back to some of that list earlier and the structure of their state. Next, please. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier giving credit to some researchers, and one of the things I found interesting was that this Suzette Some actually has been doing a lot of research in this area around fisheries. I think she's was a PhD candidate, probably graduated now, out of Dalhousie University. I just want to put a context, just a little bit of a sidebar that I thought was interesting, that how academics been able to get more publications than perhaps necessary. She published an article in the journal Environmental Science and Policy in June of 2017 with a title. And then in July of 2017, she published an article in Marine Policy with a slightly variation. But as I read both articles, it's the same thing. But anyway, she successfully produced 2 publications within 60 days. But what's interesting in her work is that her case study focused in one of the papers on fisheries and oceans and the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization, a little closer to home. And what the main conclusion of her study is that what works or doesn't work, it all depends on information flow and how things are communicated. Because you can be in the same room saying things and not necessarily communicating. But go to the next slide, because I think I have another slide on that. So just before I go to some of the larger communication challenges, her conclusion: establishing a formal, well-defined information flow process ensures credibility, relevance, and legitimacy. And she observed that existed for the most part in an organization like NAFO and DFO as well. Some may not necessarily agree with that. I think it's contextual. But she did note differences in regions and structures inside of, say, Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And so I won't repeat myself, but she did note that if the information flow existed, the uptake of scientific advice was more likely. She talked about, this is more of a NAFO thing, but the organizational design is key to understanding the challenges and enablers for movement of information. So if the organization is designed in such a way to allow information to flow, then it works better. But there are some systemic barriers in many organizations that has an effect on that information is flowing. And she very much concluded that the more traditional approach, produce a document, included in a plan or whatever, doesn't necessarily allow for information flow. And she also noted that especially in the complex world of ecosystems approach to fisheries management, which arguably is trying to take off, but not really, information flow is absolutely the key to success. Next, please. So what I said, talking and writing is not always communicating. Science is very complex and often very confusing to a non-science audience. And this is especially true when people have their mind made up before they start listening. And so, as soon as a scientist says a specific sentence, a word, a description that's inconsistent with what they want as an outcome, it's tuned out. So you have that challenge as well. And the policy process, I would argue, it's up to you to tell me that I'm wrong, often is not understood within the scientific community. I think the scientific community focuses a lot on the policy outcome, that one thing, that quota, that something, or funding decision, as opposed to all of these external other factors that we described earlier that go into the policy making process. I just want to give you a couple of, speak to Indigenous and international examples. I've often concluded that they're the same. Now, you may not agree with me on that, but when I say they're the same, is when I've met with over 400 Indigenous communities in Canada, who actually went to their communities. And communication is an extremely challenging thing when you don't have true context of culture, true context of experience, worldview, and it's the same in the international context. About 15 years ago, I chaired a session here at the Marine Institute with a group of, I think it was 12 countries on fisheries enforcement. In the first day, there was absolutely zero communication, although we were all speaking English, because we didn't speak to institutional framework. So a Canadian would say, very difficult to prove a case. We need to get evidence. We need to do this. We need an observer. We need vessel monitoring systems. We need port inspection procedures. And the Portuguese were like absolutely confused, because in their mind, if you're going 2 knots, you're fishing, therefore you're guilty, because it's a different legal system. The Germans were absolutely astounded that we would hire observers that didn't work for the government and use evidence in court. Like, that was totally unheard of. Communication, context, and it's the same in Indigenous communities. We feel we're doing a wonderful job of describing a situation, but that's not their worldview, and it's not their context, and it's not their place where they live, and therefore we don't communicate. Next, please. So, good thing, because I really only have I guess I have 10 minutes. Conclusions and some observations. So my main conclusions are science is complex, expensive, and often depend on extended periods of time for results. Not great for the policymakers' world. Results are, I need it in 2 weeks. Trump needs a vaccine before November the 3rd. I keep raising that example because it's an excellent illustration of what's going on around us. Fishery science is especially complex due to uncertainty, environmental change, lack of inputs into resource management of fisheries. Now, let me stop for a second. I want to clarify that. That was a poor word choice on my part. Lack of inputs into resource management of fisheries. I don't mean they don't have input into the resource management of fisheries. I saw that this morning and realized what a mistake I made. What I was trying to say is that we, all of us, do not have all the inputs into fisheries management, like, say, silviculture or farming. we're dependent on environmental conditions for inputs. And so we're trying to manage this piece on the side, really, not the total picture. And one of the better examples, and I got to give all the credit here to DFO scientists for explaining this to me, but the Newfoundland shelf, the northern edge for some species, the southern edge for other species, you know, of the boreal world, ups and downs, very, very vulnerable to environmental change and very, very difficult to predict. I've noticed from a policy perspective that structures like long-term economic structures like individual transferable quotas and things that many people believe stabilizes a fisheries, others say not, are more likely to occur where the environment is more stable. Southwest Nova Scotia, coast of British Columbia up until a couple of years ago, Iceland, New Zealand. Whereas in areas where there's more significant change on the environmental side, that kind of thing rarely takes hold because there's some catastrophic event that causes everything to go in another direction. Next slide, please. Continuing on, policy making is often mixed and does not always have clear objectives. I think that's obvious to all of us, especially if you're only looking at it from the external, from that one policy decision. It's very difficult to understand why. It's significantly impacted by the externalities, as we talked about, as well as by the political and social values of society in general or of any particular moment in time. Virtually all policy making carries complexity, risk, and uncertainty. Yet perceptions of complexity, risk, cost, and benefit vary between competing stakeholders, especially in fisheries. So you have that very challenging dynamic taking place, I think, in fisheries all the time. Bottom line, policy is about choices between many, many options. And somehow science got to find its way in that world. And of course, the individual decision can have huge consequences. Sorry, I get some water. For years of work for an individual scientist or a group of scientists, and that constant flux certainly, I think, speaks significantly to that science policy interface in fisheries. Bottom line, it's about communication. I don't know if there's another slide. Is there another slide? Next. Yes. So how can you help? Well, I think you seek to communicate science in a manner that's applicable and understood by your audience. The old line, speak to your audience. Many scientists, and I see some of you here on this call, on this seminar today, are very good at this, and it's been very, very helpful and very clear. And I think if there's any major, it's probably, and Kim would be pleased to have me say this, but I think communication has played a significant role in how science is seen today. And clear information presented to your audience is the key, I think, for achieving true science involvement and influence on the policy process. Key to what you can do is enhance the public understanding of science here, especially in an academic context. Always keep your message in mind associated with your research. Your probability of research getting uptake, getting interest, will very much depend on your ability to communicate it. And of course, you should take the time to learn the policymaker's perspective and offer to share your perspective. And I'll go back to where I started. It's important that policymakers in their academic training have some knowledge of the science process, if it involves fisheries or anything else. And it's equally important, and perhaps not done enough, that scientists in the academic context have some understanding of the context from a policymaker's perspective. And I think the next slide says questions. Yes. So I think I'm on time, and I'll stop there and turn it over to the moderator or the chair here.
Yes. Thank you very much, Kevin, for that very interesting talk. So if people have some questions, you can say it or you can put it on the chat and maybe we can read it. So if you have questions, then raise your hand and we can give you the time to do the question. Any questions? Yeah, I have one raised hand. You're unmuted.
Yeah, Kevin, it's Fred Phelan. Morning or good day, depending on where you are. A couple of observations. One, you spoke to the unintended impacts associated with fishing EI. I don't see a lot of research around that area, and it was quite refreshing to hear you speak to that subject. So it's probably something somewhere, certainly the folks at MUN might be well positioned to sort of dig into that. I think there's a couple of really interesting papers possibly to come out of that. So I would encourage that research. On the interaction between fisheries management and science, I mean, you spoke pretty refreshingly about that as well. I mean, to me, it's maybe simplistically, you spoke to things like pressure responses and decision making. So to me, the balance, the pressure between those two things, science being, and I would comment that those being the fish and the extractors, the decision between those two things is complex and lots of things going in there. Do you think that the balance is right? Do you think the balance between the science, the fish, and the extraction side of that ecosystem, is that balance right? And is the balance changing as the electorate changes?
Yeah, the balance question first, Fred, and then the second piece. It's hard to know if it's right. Like Fred, I think you need to think about in a contextually. I've worked extensively in British Columbia, and out in British Columbia, in my mind, there's a significant amount of resources devoted to the science of salmon that far exceeds. Some people would argue, the economic value, but there's many indigenous and cultural issues at stake. And then you take that to, something like northern shrimp, where the ratio is quite, not the same. But from the stakeholder perspective, I think we're doing a reasonable job here in Canada at finding that balance. I know I sense an evolution, not in all fisheries in all sectors, but I certainly see an evolution where industry, or the harvesters, if you will, are taking a much more active role in understanding that if they do not have a science, quote unquote, in their harvesting structure, that the old arguments, I want it because I want it, doesn't work because their markets are not responding. And you see these institutional frameworks or these structures emerging where, it's more important today for many harvesters to prove to the European community that what they're doing is sustainable than it is to their audience in Canada. So I'm not sure, Fred, if I got a good sense of balance, but I do sense it's a changing world. And comes with that, of course, some challenges, I think, for science on the other end, where it's less about the traditional regulator science being the dominant information flow. It's coming more that you get sidebar issues. And that's where I get concerned about biases and things like that. So there's a number of things interplaying, Fred. I think overall it's improving. It's better than it was, but I think we need to be cautious about where all that's going, especially in the complex environmental shifts that we're observing, whether it's climate change or just pure North Atlantic oscillation movements. Doesn't matter. It's changing anyway. Sorry, Fred, I've already forgotten the second part of your question.
No, I sort of made an observation about the unintended impacts of EI, and I think there's a bunch of research that needs to be done there in terms of the impact on fish.
Yeah, I think the fisheries part is very interesting on EI. I think the principle of EI is fundamental. I understand there's changes coming to EI in the post-COVID. There's nothing like a crisis to generate change. But the impact on fisheries, there's some very interesting research you could do on just how that's necessarily warping. And Fred, I think you could actually look at what's going on in Nova Scotia today in the last weekend or so and make connections to something like EI and why you're seeing that conflict on the water. But I'll leave that for another time.
Okay, well, we have another question. I'm going to ask one myself. You mentioned something about one of the things that we can do is for scientists to try to get the policies perspective. And as a science student myself, I'm wondering, like, how can we get that perspective? You think it is a training gap that we have, or with our training, we're like, how can we get that to be able to be more effective in get our science to the policymakers?
So the practitioners of fisheries science in a regulator context, and I don't mean only DFO, it could be anywhere in the world, do have access in ways that you as a student or as an academic do not, for sure. So yes, what I'm implying is that I think you've, through your own organized series or how you structure your own individual learning, because most of you, I think, you are graduate students, seek out that opportunity and for yourself, and ask and find people who you can ask questions on, and build some of that knowledge base. And I would say one more piece on that: be very, very careful about generalization, because what I say is what I said based on my experience and my history. But be careful with transferring that if you're working in Africa or working in Iceland or working in an Indigenous context in Northern Canada. You need to understand the sources of the policies in that particular society and structure. And that's why not entirely why, maybe it's coincidence, I talked about trying to understand these out structures of policy at the beginning. What are the agenda setting processes in that particular society? So I think it's very contextual, and but there are many general elements of it. I just be cautious about application, in an Indigenous context, for example.
Thank you. Any other question?
I have a question. I just put it in the chat.
Okay, nice.
Do you mind if I ask it?
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks so much, Kevin. This is Evan Andrews. I really appreciated your talk today. And I know we've talked a little bit before about this, but I wonder what the mechanism for, if you have a lot of fisheries policy occurring outside of the regulator context, and you need some information about how that policy might work or how it might be implemented. I wonder what you thought the mechanism is for folks who all have responsibility over different policies that affect the fisheries to work together.
Yeah, I just, a very good point, Evan. Just let me emphasize one element. So the actual policy, it depends on the jurisdiction, the country, and the context. The actual policy decision of whatever manifestation that takes in fisheries is the role of government. Remember what I said about what Jenkins and Dahl said back in post-World War II, and that's true. What we're really talking about here is the influencers of policy. And increasingly, that's a global dynamic, and it's certainly outside of the regulator's domain. And more, things like non-government organizations. I use my tuna example. So that's part of the new challenge, Evan, is that it's becoming extremely diverse and often very interest focused. So it's trying to figure out how it gets incorporated. And traditional consultations or whatever we want to call them doesn't seem to work well in that context because it's more narrow in who the audience are. So it appears is that I would suggest that this is an area of research, and I know you have done a lot of research on this sort of thing and perspectives, is how do researchers, it's almost like it's a role for the academic world because it's hard to figure out where else it would fit in being able to communicate the sheer scale in a neutral fashion of what's going on out there. So, you know, we have some very good opportunities in the new world of communication, social media, pros and cons, but that instrument allows for the sharing of information in fashions that we never had before. So it's like we're going through this phase where we're getting the good and the bad of communication. And until we figure out extracting the good parts of it to allow bringing these different interest groups together, then that remains a challenge. It's interesting, Evan, that if you were to look at many indigenous societies, they've been very well structurally at bringing together various perspectives into a common outcome. It's a bit more complex in many elements of our sort of European society, if you will, where the things are not wired that way, but it's learning from others. It's obviously communicating, providing information, but I think it's back maybe to a point that Fred said about EI. It's about having research in these areas of how we're not connecting or we are connecting, making good use of best case studies and things of that nature.
Okay, it is. Oh, you were going to talk?
Me, no.
Okay. It is almost an hour, so I think we can finish here. Thank you very much, Kevin, for opening our series. As I said, we're very honored to have you as the first speaker. For all the participants, thank you very much to join us, and please stay tuned for our seminar series that we're gonna continue doing every Wednesday at 11, and we're gonna distribute all the information so you can join and you can see what are the other topics. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to say thank you to the Fisheries and Marine Institute Graduate Society for the opportunity. I think I'm pronouncing your new organization name for the first time quickly. For the opportunity to participate, I want to thank all of you who joined us and certainly for the questions. And remember, you know, like all of these things, it's all about facilitating thought. It's just my view. There are other views. And but if you're interested, there's lots of literature on the policy making process, both in Canada and internationally. So thank you.